Hello and welcome to What's Happening in Myanmar, a weekly show from the Frontier Myanmar podcast family. At Frontier, we know how hard keeping track of events in Myanmar can be. And in this podcast, your host, Luke Corbin, that's me, is joined by journalists and experts to discuss some of the most consequential, convoluted, or just plain interesting stories of the past week. It's Friday, January 31. And this is episode 13. Today, to talk all about the big news of the USAID funding freeze, I'm joined by Minnie, a Myanmar INGO worker with a decade of experience, including in projects receiving USAID funding. Minnie is using a pseudonym, and her voice has been disguised. Good afternoon, Minnie.
Hello, I am Minnie.
I am also joined for the United States perspective by Erin Murphy, Senior Fellow at the Center for Strategic and International Studies and author of the 2022 book, Burmese, Haze, U.S. Policy and Myanmar's Opening and Closing. Erin joins us from Washington, D.C. Hello.
Thank you for having me.
But before getting to our guests, let's dive right into the other news of the week. It looks likely that the Myanmar National Democratic Alliance Army, or the MNDAA, does plan to withdraw this year from the major trading town of Lashio in northern Shan State, nearby the Myanmar military's Northeastern Regional Military Command. The military lost the significant town and base last July as part of wider losses across northern Shan State during the Three Brotherhood Alliance's Operation 1027, beginning in October 2023. This operation relied on support from newer resistance groups formed after the 2021 coup and went relatively unimpeded by China. However, the conquest of Lashio in particular prompted China to involve itself more openly, and a ceasefire between the MNDAA and the military was signed 2 weeks ago. This week, Chinese officials visiting Lashio for Chinese New Year were quoted by an MNDAA source as saying, "We told you not to attack Lashio from the beginning." The MNDAA withdrawing from Lashio and the manner in which it does so would significantly affect conflict dynamics in northern Shan State, as discussed in episode 1 of this podcast. But even with all this talk and direct public Chinese pressure, it's important to remember that previous ceasefires between the MNDAA and the Myanmar military have all broken down sooner or later, and Lashio is the MNDAA's biggest prize in 1027. In other parts of northern Shan State, tensions have been increasing between the Ta'an and Kachin communities and their armed groups. A video was distributed online showing fistfights and verbal altercations in areas of mixed influence and control between the Ta'an National Liberation and Kachin Independence Armies. One fracas broke out during a sit-down attempt to defuse the tensions in Namkan Township, with some Kachin soldiers injured by rocks thrown by a large crowd that descended upon them. If Kachin and Ta'ang armed groups can't come to a lasting understanding that's supported by local communities in northern Shan State, then the region will be even less able to withstand pressure from the Myanmar military. And the Kachin Independence Army, or KIA, is still busily fighting the military nearby to the west in Bhamo, with the group taking over the strategic town's airport last Friday. For an interview about the battle for Bhamo, see episode 11 of this podcast. The Myanmar military continues to defend its remaining artillery battalion and operations command bases in the town. If they fall, then the KIA will control Bhamo, which it has been closing in on and fighting for 2 months now. The military is hitting the town with daily airstrikes in its effort to stymie the KIA successes. And airstrikes are still hitting elsewhere in Myanmar, with at least 21 people killed and over 20 injured by military airstrikes across the country this week. Crucial civilian infrastructure has also been destroyed, including the Jaltme General Hospital, which the Ta'ang National Liberation Army, who control Jaltme, may struggle to easily rebuild or replace in the current conflict conditions. Now, to find out more about what else has been happening in Myanmar this week, consider becoming a Frontier member if you aren't already. Then you can receive news briefings and translated stories right into your inbox every weekday. Visit frontiermyanmar.net/membership. Now let's bring in Minnie and Erin to unpack the USAID crisis for Myanmar. A little bit of background. On January 20, newly inaugurated United States President Donald Trump signed a flurry of executive orders in his unusual attempt to drastically disrupt and reshape the US and its engagement with other countries. Several of those orders had immediate effects on Myanmar. Trump temporarily suspended the refugee admissions program, blocking Myanmar refugees, even those who already had visas and were on flights to the US at the time, from entering the US. He also signed an order re-evaluating and realigning United States foreign aid, I quote, which put a 90-day freeze on foreign development assistance and requested all such programs be reviewed. The language of the order had a chilling effect on pro-democratic forces around the world, with its purpose in the order stating, I read, "The United States foreign aid industry and bureaucracy are not aligned with American interests and, in many cases, are antithetical to American values. They serve to destabilize world peace by promoting ideas in foreign countries that are directly inverse to harmonious and stable relations internal to and among countries." U.S. foreign development assistance, including from the U.S. Agency for International Development, that's USAID, supports Myanmar people in many ways, and reports soon emerged of safe houses for political refugees in Thailand now being unable to pay rent, exile media organizations running out of money, refugees in health emergencies being unable to reach hospital, and some even dying from a lack of oxygen access. US food and nutritional support to Rohingya refugees in Bangladesh were luckily exempted from this pause. And on January 28, USA Secretary of State Marco Rubio announced a temporary waiver on the pause for certain kinds of purely humanitarian assistance. But the effects on Myanmar communities and the anti-coup resistance movement in particular in this first week of the pause were already deeply felt. And the major USAID Inclusive Federal Democracy Activity Program was also confirmed to be suspended for 90 days. The Alternative National Unity Government, or NUG, has sought to downplay the current funding crisis. In a press conference on Wednesday, NUG Foreign Minister Zinma Aung said the NUG would seek to address President Trump directly about his new policy, while her Deputy Minister, Mozo U, claimed the USAID freeze would, I quote, not have a direct impact on the revolution, unquote. Direct may be the operative word here, as most impacts on the revolution would probably be indirect. On the same day, the US announced it was cancelling $45 million in funding for the Diversity and Inclusion Scholarship Program for Myanmar students, with President Trump himself remarking on live TV on the blockage, and his words really betrayed a lack of understanding and interest in how those funds were actually being used to provide Burmese people with opportunities to study outside of Myanmar. Okay, now to our guests. There's been a lot to keep track of, regarding these developments, but that's about where things stand right now. So, Erin, let's start with you. As a US foreign policy and Myanmar foreign relations expert, how shocking is all this? Did you have any forewarning in Washington, D.C.?
I think there has been some forewarning if you looked at Project 2025, which was the close to 900-page or more report that the Heritage Foundation put out, which is a Washington, D.C.-based think tank, where they really outlined almost singularly every role within the White House, but also how certain departments and agencies should operate. You could also kind of get a sense from Trump and his remarks on the campaign trail and just kind of the sentiment of Americans as well. There's this persistent narrative, which is incorrect, that 50% of the U.S. budget goes to foreign assistance and aid. That is not true. It's very minuscule when it comes to the overall U.S. budget. I think another thing, to Trump's remarks is just the U.S. is always taking care of the rest of the world, whether it's, paying for troops overseas or paying into something like the World Health Organization, and it's not fair and it's time for other countries to step up. And, I think for Trump, he just doesn't necessarily see the bigger picture as to what aid and assistance looks like. They're pretty down on it in the domestic context, when it comes to welfare or any assistance programs. So that, I think, applies to foreign assistance as well. The fact that would happen overnight, I don't think people expected that, maybe a review while things keep going, but not to put a freeze or such a pause.
And how about you, Minnie? Did you have a chance to prepare? What was the fallout from your side?
On January 20th, we saw Trump's executive orders in the news and, began to question its implication for us. By Friday, January 24th, the Secretary of State issued a cable that activated that executive order. During that week, we have various reports indicating that organizations were informing their partner to cease operations. Soon after, we also received direct instructions from our boss, to stop all work immediately and to notify our local partners to do the same. We anticipated a pause movement, but the enforcement of the stop work order turned out to be more stringent than we had expected. As a result, all partners halted the use of USAID funds. So any planned activities could only be executed independently without the USAID support. Currently, we have not received any further instructions. However, the serious situation in Washington, D.C. highlights our heavy reliance on foreign aid across all sectors, particularly in humanitarian efforts, an area in which I have limited understanding. Yeah.
Thanks, Minnie. So, Erin, reviewing programs is a pretty standard thing for a newly elected government to do in the United States. But the 90-day immediate freeze is it totally unprecedented?
That is right. And any executive administration, any president has the authority through executive orders to take policy steps. Some of them can be incredibly impactful. But, there is a balance. There is supposed to be a separation of powers. So, I think we're still in a phase, at the time of this recording, where I think Washington, D.C., lawyers, Congress, NGOs, civil society, anything where the government touches your life is assessing what is the legality of some of these things, because especially when it comes to foreign assistance, that's money that's appropriated by Congress. So the executive branch is compelled to spend it, and Trump is saying otherwise. You can't just stop things, especially if they've been obligated, that contracts have been signed. There's certainly a legality to that. But, I guess we'll have to see whether Trump really operates on the confines of the law or, takes his own interpretation of things.
So why exactly is it happening this way? Some people say that this is President Trump not understanding the consequences. As a president, he doesn't think things through, while others interpret the aid freeze as actually very strategic. What do you think?
So I think it's the latter. I think that this is strategic. I think there's been a lot of thinking behind it. Is this all Trump's idea? I don't really think so, but it is certainly like the brainchild of a lot of the advisors he's been surrounding himself with. There is a through line through, his consistent policies, whether it's on trade deficits or, the unfairness of how America has been treated and bringing back jobs. And a lot of it is around America first. It is also around some of these, more conservative principles that you see in the Republican Party of having a smaller government, which means smaller budgets. Usually those cuts come first and foremost to aid and assistance programs, both domestically and, in this case, foreign. And they really have done a good job in trying to promote a narrative that, federal workers are the villains, and throw into this idea of like woke and also this like anti-immigrant, anti-foreigner sentiment. Why should we help people overseas when people are suffering in the United States. Again, I don't urge everyone to read Project 2025. But, I think if you start looking at the writings and what folks have been saying that are close to this administration, whether it's the OMB person who really hates federal spending, Elon Musk, Donald Trump himself, I think that it has been strategic. No Republicans are really standing up, although they were looking for exceptions because it started to hit their constituents. So, everybody's for cuts until it actually hits their voters.
Okay. And bringing it back to USAID and Myanmar, Erin, you've written about US engagement in Myanmar up to the period just after the coup. For you, what can USAID do? What has it done for Myanmar? And I guess, therefore, what's at risk?
It's done a lot in terms of agriculture. It can go to sectors that the private sector is not going to invest in to hopefully get a country to a place where the economy is stable enough for investors to go there. So, for example, like agriculture or, doing this capacity training and skills-based. So things like the tourism industry or textiles and manufacturing can grow. So USAID can do quite a lot in that. And I think we've seen, the benefit of that, especially when you have this, semi-democratic opening from 2010 up until the coup, where you had people with English language skills that could work in an office, and I think that was really important. They did a lot in terms of rule of law and also with national reconciliation, the peace process, all which is important. And a lot of that is just bringing in or finding a safe space for people to be able to speak and to speak their mind. It is also to provide, capacity building when it comes to negotiating. I think it's hard to look at USAID programs, especially on something like the peace process and national reconciliation, and really put metrics to it because you're not really going to see. That's a long process. That's something that's been an issue in Myanmar for decades and decades. Compound that with the trauma and ongoing military rule and subsequent coups, that's not going to make a fast process. And there are going to be several steps backwards. But, I think also USAID was really important after the coup. It was still COVID. And so there were multiple emergencies going around Myanmar. So, the ability to provide health and medical aid, to provide food, to connect with local NGOs, which I think really proved themselves during Cyclone Nargis in 2008. So using those networks to make sure that people who needed resources got them. So in some ways, I think what you were hoping USAID would do, especially after 2010, was to really build up the country with the skills and the knowledge to kind of continue its development and get it out of least developed country status. But with the coup and even with COVID, I think, there's a lot of step back. So start with the basics, the sustenance, making sure that people's daily needs are being met. So it's certainly impactful. And it is not just in the country, but on the border as well, where there's so many refugees. Thailand can't necessarily support all of these folks that are there. And these are folks that want to get back in the country. So they need the skills to be able to go in where hopefully there is a democratic government and they'll have the ability to know how to write laws, to effectuate them, to be implementers, or, to organize, to start NGOs that help people, civil society, but also to be business persons and, build an economy that way. So, they have a long experience in this. They found good local partners on the ground. USAID is focused on localization as well, which I think is a good thing. It does have a huge impact on communities.
Thank you, Erin. And Minnie, Erin's talked about the importance of humanitarian efforts, but also mentioned democracy at the end there. So I want to ask you more specifically, Minnie, how important is USAID funding to the current Myanmar pro-democracy movement? Where does it go?
To answer this question, I acknowledge that I may have not a complete understanding due to the limited information available. However, it seems that a significant portion of democracy funding is allocated to administrative costs rather than directly supporting program activities. However, there are some small grants that are directed towards the national unity governments, civil disobedience movements, and national unity consultative councils, as well as look at ethnic governance groups through the civil society organizations. But importantly, the bulk of financial support for pro-democracy movement primarily relies on contributions from the people of Myanmar, both domestically and abroad. For example, essential activities such as evacuating individuals from conflict zones in conflict areas, and also providing food, shelter, education, medical assistance, security, and support for the CDMs are largely funded through these grassroots communication. However, the USAID's findings, also provide partially to these activities that I mentioned before.
Great. I think that's quite helpful to hear that from someone in your position. Can I ask about that? You and your colleagues, how are you handling the situation at the moment?
Oh, I don't see many manageable options available right now. Of course, we are getting questions from our partners about what the next steps will be when we resume operation or how we continue moving forward, and so on. However, many local partners seem to understand that we are all affected by this executive order. Everyone is facing challenges. So for now, our focus is, to closely monitor the situation in Washington, D.C., stay informed and preparing for whatever instructions come next, whether, there's a quick return to work or a complete shutdown of our activities. If all projects were to cease permanently, there would be a considerable amount of administrative work needed to wrap things out and reporting, etc. Worrying and panicking for the time being won't help us in this situation. So to be able to maintain a relationship with our local partners, I am helping them implementing activities at no cost or providing some technical assistance for their planned activities if it is aligned to my expertise. So this is how we are, confronting the situation right now. Not many options we have.
Okay, so as hinted at there, and thank you, Minnie, is that this freeze and review seems to include a prohibition against USAID employees from being transparent or even communicating at all with their funding recipients and implementing partners. We're talking about some working relationships that could go back years, and USAID employees are even rumored to be being fired or stood down for trying to keep their recipients informed. What's your take from the US side? Are people actually losing their jobs just for talking to their colleagues?
It's a complete mess. And I think that folks in Myanmar might see some eerie parallels to what's happening in the United States and the government as to what happened in some departments and agencies and ministries in Myanmar when the junta took over, the many times it's taken over. I've heard the same thing, that government officials can't talk to their implementing partners. They can't talk to anyone outside of the organization. I've heard that from neighbors. I've heard that from friends that all told me this, quietly, not in any sort of written communication. But, even within my own organization, we have government grants, too, that fund some of our programming and research. And we haven't heard from anybody. And so, sometimes we've heard from departments, including defense, that have asked us clarifying questions about policy, and then that's it. We don't really get much response beyond that. So, what is a fireable offense? I think it's very confusing right now, and perhaps that's the point. 60 senior officials, 60 officials in USAID were put on administrative leave for apparently, breaking the rules. Other government agencies, people have been put on administrative leave or fired because they're not fulfilling, the spirit and letter of the executive orders. So it's a chilling effect, which I think is part of the point here.
Back over to you, Minnie, for your final thoughts. How do you see the near-term future here? Can affected programs find alternative funding within the next 90 days or now 80 days? And do you think many programs after their review will ultimately be cut?
It may be quite challenging for organizations that depend entirely on USAID funding to secure alternative financial resources within the next 19 days. While there are potential options being discussed, none have materialized thus far. And also, the problem is that, there are lots of locals there who depend solely on their USA funding salary. So I can imagine that they are facing a difficult situation and are desperately looking for alternative options for fundings or new job opportunities, that kind of things happening. And also, all the DEI-related activities are diversity, equity, and inclusions it's likely to be stopped even after 19 days reviews. But I am not sure how things will turn out because, even in Washington, D.C., situations change in every hours, right? So it's very difficult to say. And also, I think this situation serves as a crucial wake-up call for all of us, emphasizing the needs for genuine efforts to stabilize sustainability in these humanitarian sectors and also the social development sectors as well. These forwarding aids for Burma is, it is good for us, but at the same time, we became dependent on the foreign aids, especially, it's very risky to depend on one country's aid. So this is, I'm for the time being, I'm really, really, how can I say, everything's is in chaos situation. Everybody's, affected by this executive order, especially who's directly working with the USAID fundings. But I think it's also more impact on the American citizens, not only, our the aid workers. But it is really, really a wake-up call for us. What we really, really want to do about, the social development, political development in Myanmar. How are we going to continue? How are we move forward without the foreign aid? I think this is the question, and this is where we have to focus for the future.
That is very candid. Well, we're out of time now. So, Erin, could you take the final word? What do you see happening next in America? You've mentioned potential pressure points, the legality of the whole thing. Could the 90-day suspension be over in a week or two and just be a 21-day suspension? And if it goes the full 90 days, what's going to happen next?
It feels very desperate. I take a lot of this personally, having worked in Myanmar, worked with these communities and knowing how desperate it can get. I'm seeing it with friends of mine that are likely to lose their jobs, and some of which already have. And there has been pushback. There's been a lot of frustration as well about lack of pushback. At the end of the day, you could say, well, this is what America wanted, but I think we're starting to find out that maybe America doesn't want all this stuff. For those of us that work in the foreign policy space and see the benefit of aid and assistance and alliances and partnerships and promoting democracy and fighting authoritarian regimes, why this is important. And the thought of that going away is disheartening because that's been a hallmark of American policy. Do we get everything right? Absolutely not. Have we made a mess? Of course. But, you can always assume America eventually will do the right thing. And I hope that's the case. You're starting to see sparks of the resistance. You're starting to have representatives who are Democrats who are hearing from their, Republican constituents that are upset. And so, and I think what are the pressure points with Trump? Well, I don't think he cares about his base anymore because there's not going to be, he can't run for office again unless they change the Constitution. I wish I had better things to say, but it's not looking too great because even, in the first administration, you had a lot of companies push back and they're capitulating. And so, it's really going to take a groundswell within the U.S. I don't know. We need our morale boosted as well. And, I think this week has been a total shock, but I think that's also really lit a fire in a few folks who know what the outcome could be. So in 90 days, Marco Rubio has things that he has supported in Congress. I'm hoping Congress is going to take a look back and say, oh, this works. Maybe it's a different wording of things. But these are early days and they seem pretty dark right now. So I usually don't like to end on a sad note, but there we are.
Thanks, Erin. It has been a wild ride this week. I want to thank you so much for joining the podcast in this tumultuous time.
I appreciate it. Thanks for having me on. And hopefully next time we're talking about much happier things.
And Minnie, I really appreciate you being available to give us your perspective as an experienced practitioner in the middle between USAID and the people who need the aid.
Okay, so thank you.
That brings this episode to a close. For listeners who want more on this aid debacle, check the Frontier Myanmar website for a new feature story that was released today, titled America First in Action. Well, until next week, farewell and take care.